Good evening. Nice. I'm Robert Prezant, the Dean of the College of Science and Mathematics, and I want to welcome all of you to the Fall 2012 Margaret and Herman Sokol Science Lecture. I truly appreciate seeing almost a full house here tonight because I know there was some competition on the tube. But I'm glad I had the opportunity to actually mention that because I have a segue here to encourage all of you to make sure that the first Tuesday in November you get out there and vote, because there's an incredibly important item that will be on your ballot if you're from New Jersey, and that's the Higher Education Infrastructure Bond, which will help universities across the state of New Jersey as we reinvest in higher education, hopefully. There's been a significant gap in funding for higher education, especially in the infrastructure. And as you look around the Montclair State campus, you do see a good number of new buildings that have come up over the past 13 years, a significant number of buildings. I should note that there has not been a penny of state funds that has gone to any of those buildings. Now, the critical moment for this particular bond issue is the fact that if the bond issue is passed, we are going to start building the Center for Environmental and Life Sciences for the College of Science and Mathematics. So I am encouraging all of you to get out there, vote, bring your friends' friends, vote as often as you like. Montclair State University inaugurated the Sokol Science Lecture Series in fall 2002 to bring to our campus world-renowned individuals who have an outstanding record in their discipline, work in critically important areas of science, and appeal broadly to other disciplines. And tonight, I am honored to be able to introduce a scientist who fits each of these parameters and does so at the highest caliber. Dr. Jeffrey Friedman is a molecular geneticist at New York City's Rockefeller University. His discovery of the hormone leptin and its role in regulating body weight has played a major role in studies on human obesity. Dr. Friedman was born in Orlando, but grew up in North Woodmere, not far from my old neighborhood in New York, graduating from Hewlett High School. He attended Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and in 1977, he received his MD from Albany Medical College of Union University at the age of 22. As a postgraduate, he completed 2 residencies at Albany Medical Center Hospital, 2 postgraduate fellowships, one at Rockefeller and then one at Cornell University Medical College. In 1986, he received his PhD in the lab of Dr. James Darnell Jr. and was then appointed assistant professor at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. In 1991, he was named head of the laboratory, and in 1995, promoted to professor, and then in 1999, Marilyn M. Simpson, professor and ongoing head of the Laboratory of Molecular Genetics at Rockefeller University. In 2005, he was elected as a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, a member of the National Academy of Sciences and its Institute of Medicine. Dr. Friedman was awarded the very prestigious Albert Lasker Award for Basic Medical Research in 2010. He has also received the Shore Prize in Life Science and Medicine, the Kao Medical Science Prize for Medical Research, the Jesse Stevenson Kovalenko Medal from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the Danone International Prize for Nutrition, the Gardner Foundation International Award, the Pisano Foundation Award. I could go on. Tonight, he will be presenting on his scientific breakthrough work on obesity in a lecture entitled "To Eat or Not to Eat, Leptin and the Biological Basis of Obesity." It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Friedman.
Well, thank you for the invitation and the wonderful introduction, and for welcoming me to your wonderful campus. It's really a great honor to have my name listed alongside all the other people who've given such a set of stimulating lectures, most of which I would have liked to have seen myself. I'd also like to thank you all for coming, and tonight, knowing that the debate is about to begin, I just want to alert you that after my last lecture, I was told I needed to be feistier. So if I spiral out of control here on stage, that's the reason why. Actually, is there a pointer? I can start now, but if there's a pointer, that'd be great. As you can tell by the title, the topic of today's presentation is obesity. And if you look at these two images and ask the average person on the street, or even most scientists, why the individual on the left has such a different appearance from the individual on the right, they would answer correctly that the individual on the left eats too much, or eats more in all likelihood than the individual on the right. That, as I alluded to, would be true, but it would ignore what I consider to be the deeper question, which is, why do they eat too much? Why do they eat more than the individual on the right? And the answer to that question is different, I'll try to convince you, than you might read about in the newspapers. And so my objective today is to deconstruct obesity and ask you to perhaps think about it in a different light than you might have before. That's a difficult task. Were I talking about any of the conditions listed here, I think everyone would intuitively defer to my expertise were I talking about mental illness, cancer, or anything else. But in the case of discourse on obesity, everybody has a deeply held set of personal beliefs that lead them, in my experience, to pay absolutely no attention to what it is I have to say at all. Everyone is an expert on this topic. The first thing a president's wife does upon assuming that exalted office is put forth some plan for dealing with obesity. And in very few cases that I know of has anyone gone to speak to people who might study this. Now, why do people have such a deeply held set of personal beliefs? Well, obesity is in the news on a regular basis. But as I'll also try to convince you, that I think the tenor of these news reports perhaps distorts what the actual realities are. Now, whatever one's view about the causes of obesity might be, there's no getting around that it's a major public health problem. For reasons we don't fully understand, obesity is associated with a set of conditions, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, fatty liver, and even some forms of cancer that in aggregate are the principal causes of morbidity and mortality in the developed world and are growing problems in the developing world. The aggregate effect of these associated conditions is shortened lifespan. And for the purposes of this discussion, I just want you to focus on the magenta line here. This was a prospective study of 2 million individuals. And what it showed that as body mass index increases, this is a surrogate for obesity that I'll have more to say about in a few moments. As body mass index increases above a key threshold, the relative risk of death increases. So this is a serious public health problem. At some level, everyone looking at a curve like this asks themselves, either consciously or unconsciously, however, the following question. If you're up here at a weight that is deemed unhealthy and that will lead you to suffer a greater risk of death, and moreover, knowing that obese individuals are promoted less readily and make less money than their no better qualified lean colleagues, why don't people who are up here on this distribution simply lose the weight and come down to here? They would avoid a social stigma. They would have better health. Now, there are lots of reasons for possible answers to that question. And I've distilled the three general explanations that are provided. One possibility to explain why obese people are so and can't lose the weight is they lack a level of willpower that's evident in lean people. I find this point of view is more often favored among lean people. A second possibility is that this is a disorder of lifestyle and environment, that it's in our modern lifestyle, a sedentary lifestyle with free availability of food, obesity is inevitable, and this is basically an environmental problem. And the third possibility is biology and genes. Now, on occasion, I've asked people in the audience to vote their preference before I spoke, or right about now, and then again after. I stopped doing that when fewer people voted for biology when I was done than when I began. So I'm not going to do that tonight, but rather ask you to think to yourself, which do I think is the most important contributor? And then what I'd like to tell you is that were I talking about any other disorder, heart disease, cancer, people would immediately gravitate to the idea that there would be some biological underpinning on which a set of environmental and behavioral factors might act. Now, for reasons that are more sociologic than scientific, discussion on this subject is more dichotomous, and people tend to prefer one explanation to the exclusion of the others. And so what I'd like to do now, before telling you about the science that we've done and hope to do, is deconstruct for you what I believe to be the relative contributions of each of these, starting with willpower. Now, the explanation is simple. All you have to do is observe that obese people in general eat more at some point in their lifespan than lean people and exercise less, and that if they simply stopped doing those two things, they would get thin. That message is reinforced over and over again in a number of ways in a form that resembles something like this, which is a mock commercial we created. Let me play this now.
Are you tired of being overweight?
That in general, if you look at the calorie counts on the label and now calculate it directly, the error rates are enormous. So if you depended on the calorie counts to decide what it is you eat, then you would do far less well than appears to happen naturally year in and year out. And this sort of argument has suggested that there must be some biological system that counts calories for us, and that feeding is a basic drive that, in a sense, seeks to maintain constancy of weight. It's very easy to demonstrate the activity of such a system in animals. So in the sort of experiment shown here, you take one group of rats and you let them eat normally. And so they'll eat this amount of food and gain weight over time. In a second group of rats, what you do now is you force feed them for a period of time as denoted by this bar. For the period of time you overfeed them, they will of course gain weight. You introduce more calories into the system. During that same interval, however, they'll consume fewer calories, and moreover, when you stop force feeding them and they're in this obese state, they'll continue to eat less until such time as their weight returned to that of a control group. In other words, it appears that there's some biological system that's telling the rat that he got fatter and is now making adjustments in how much food it voluntarily eats to get it back to some stable level. The same is true with food restriction. If you food restrict an animal for a period of time, it will lose weight, but as soon as you restore the food, it will regain the weight and go back exactly to where a control group was. Suggesting here again that there's a basic drive that is encoded in these animals and that seeks to maintain a relatively stable weight. Now, there are many instances, I should point out, where a basic drive is in contrast or is opposed by a conscious wish. This is a recurrent theme in many walks of life. And so you could ask yourself, how long could you resist a basic drive to eat? Or any of these things. So if I asked you, for example, if I told you that I would give you $5 million if you could stop breathing till the end of my lecture, no one would even bother, because you know that your conscious drive could not overcome the basic drive to eat. The same sort of interplay is evident for every one of our critical behaviors, with the exception of the fact that they play out over a longer time frame, such that we don't recognize the basic drive when it exerts its influence. And so sleeping, drinking, well, in this audience, we shouldn't talk about sex at all, how long you can hold out, but I meant this being an undergrad campus. But with eating, the basic drive plays out over 3 to 9 months, over a longer time frame. And what this means is you can lose weight in the short term, but that will engender a basic drive to eat more, much the same as I showed you in the animal that had been food restricted, and that plays out over a longer period of time. However, we don't necessarily recognize the basic drive in operation at that point. We subtly feel hungrier, and perhaps our willpower wavers. So what is the role of willpower? Well, diet effectiveness is poor, and what it would seem to suggest, based on the argument I just made, is that over the short term, the conscious drive to lose weight can win out, but over the long term, the basic drive exerts its force, much the same as I showed you for animals, and this explains perhaps why most diets fail. I'll give you an alternative explanation in a moment, but for the moment now, I want to talk about lifestyle and environment. Everyone reads in the news all the time that, as stated here, no age has ever afforded more instances of corpulency than our own. This was Thomas Short in 1727. So why the sense that this is a problem that we've never faced before? Well, the sort of evidence that argues in favor of a major environmental effect on the incidence of obesity goes something like this. We define obesity as an increased BMI, which is weight over height squared, and you're said to be overweight with a BMI over 25 and obese with a BMI over 30. And what you'll note here in this data set is that in 1976 to 1980, 15% of the U.S. population exceeded this threshold, and in a scant 2 decades, it had doubled. The incidence of obesity had doubled. Well, people then argue our genes haven't changed in that time period, so it must be the environment. Now, first, I should tell you that argument is not strictly correct on its face. natural selection can operate over very rapid time frames as we select for better or less well-adapted genes for a particular environment. But setting that aside, there's a flaw in which the data is being analyzed that's important to recognize. And that has to do with the fact that obesity or BMI is a continuous trait. We all fall along a continuous spectrum, and yet we're defining it as a dichotomous trait, meaning you have the condition if you have BMI over 30, you don't if you have BMI under 30. And what's shown here, just for illustrative purposes, is the height and weight of a 5-foot 10-inch man with BMI 24, 29, and 34.7 to just give you some sense of what this range is. So we're taking a continuous trait and looking at it as a yes or no or a dichotomous trait. Now, there's a problem in epidemiologic analyses if you do this and apply a fixed threshold for the the distributions don't look all that different, although it is true there are more people who are obese in 2000 than in 1990, and we certainly want to understand what in our environment is responsible for this increase. It would be very good for our public health if we could shift the curve back to where it was. That said, there's another question underlying this that I find more compelling. In today's environment where everyone essentially has free access to unlimited calories, why is weight so variable? How is it that weight can differ by hundreds of pounds in individuals who have the same free access to food? And the answer to that question is, to a very, very large extent, genes. Now, there are a number of ways that we can assess the genetic contribution to a particular trait. One way is to ask, does the trait run in families? And if you look, obesity runs in families. But you might say, families share the same environment, and they do. So you can do another type of experiment, which is to ask, do adopted children more closely resemble their biological parents or their adoptive parents? And what you find in systematic studies of this sort is that adopted children, despite sharing their environment with their adopted children, despite sharing more environmental factors with their adoptive parents, still resemble their biological parents. Now, the classic way to assess the genetic contributions to a trait is to study pairs of identical and non-identical twins. And if identical twins are more alike or concordant, as it's referred to, than are non-identical twins, you can calculate the genetic contribution to that trait. gave him a test meal. And before the first leptin injection, the child ate 2,000 calories in a single meal. That's the number of calories an adult will typically eat in a day. This child ate in a single meal and asked for more. After a few leptin injections, the child now ate an age-appropriate number of calories. So what happens in this child, as I just alluded to in reference to the mouse, is this. A mutation abrogates expression of this hormone. No signal is ever generated that there are adequate fat stores. A low leptin level is read out as a stimulus to eat more. The child keeps eating, burns less energy, makes more and more fat, but never makes the leptin to shut the system off. And now here's what happens after a few years of leptin treatment. This is what the child looks like. So this is the image, of course, you recognize my having begun my talk by showing you, and this is the same child. The only difference is that, in the latter case, he's been treated with this hormone leptin. So in this case, what caused the obese phenotype was not a lack of willpower. It was not a toxic environment. It was a lack of a hormone, because this child was constitutively lean, it turns out, save for the absence of leptin. Now, leptin mutations of this sort in human are a very rare cause of obesity. Hormones are poor targets for mutation, but as I'll tell you later, probably a surprisingly high frequency of mutations are now known in the circuit that responds to leptin and that causes obesity. And that obesity we have a better genetic understanding of the causes of obesity than any complex disorder that's been yet studied. Now, based on this and a whole line of evidence I won't have to have time to tell you about, we've concluded that body weight is regulated by a homeostatic system that works something like this. At your stable weight, you have a certain amount of fat and a certain amount of leptin. Food intake equals energy expenditure. Now imagine you go on a diet. Well, you're eating less, your fat mass and leptin level will fall, but I showed you for the leptin-deficient child that a low leptin level is a stimulus to eat more. And you'll continue to eat more until such time as your fat mass and your leptin level returns to the starting point. Now imagine that you overeat for a period of time. You go on a binge of eating. Your fat mass and leptin level will go up, and this will suppress appetite, again, until such time as your fat mass and leptin level return to the starting point. The older of the two leptin-deficient children had not entered puberty despite being at a bone age where she should have. And that's shown here, where she doesn't have the normal oscillations of sex hormones FSH and LH. And what they found was when they gave this child leptin, she began to cycle normally. When they stopped the leptin, she stopped cycling. This suggested that leptin may also play a role in human fertility, and this fit very well into a hypothesis by a woman named Rose Frisch, an investigator at Harvard, who suggested that fat might make a substance needed for fertility. The evidence Rose cited was that heavier girls often enter puberty sooner than do thinner girls, and adult women who become very thin as a consequence or often associated with anorexia nervosa, long-distance running, and so on, often stop menstruating. And we now know that leptin is that fat substance that Frisch hypothesized because of studies of a condition known as hypothalamic amenorrhea. As I mentioned, this is the type of infertility very thin women often get. It accounts actually for a third of visits to infertility clinics and affects 4 to 8% of women of reproductive age. These women are thin and have low leptin levels, and sure enough, as shown by Chris Monsouros, if you give leptin back, you can restore reproductive function in women who have this condition, despite the fact that they actually get thinner. Now, all of this evidence has suggested that leptin can be viewed as an important, perhaps a master regulator of nutritional state. It interprets your nutrition by measuring the amount of fat you carry and then signals to probably every other tissue to transduce a signal that tells that system how to function. Now, I think people intuit that nutrition's effective has an important impact on physiology, and what this simply says is that leptin may be an important conduit by which that happens. And as I also showed you, leptin deficiency can cause disease states, and giving the leptin back in these and other conditions can fix pathology. What's not on this list, however, is obesity, which is the subject of tonight's discussion. And that's because obesity is not a leptin deficiency state. Rather, obese patients in general have high leptin levels. And that's shown here, where the amount of fat an individual carries is related to the leptin concentration in blood. And what you'll note here is that in general, the more obese an individual is, the more leptin they have rather than less. Now, in medicine, when you see high levels of a hormone, in the absence of a hormone effect, in this case to reduce weight, as I showed you for the leptin deficient child, we assume that the individual is resistant to the hormone, that the hormone they make, for some reason, doesn't work well enough. And the classic example of this is the fact that most type 2 diabetics have high, not low, insulin levels. So this suggests something like the following. There's a relative block in the obese to leptin action. It doesn't work on brain centers that control appetite with the same potency that it does in an individual of average weight. As a consequence, less effective signal is generated. Food intake now increases and energy expenditure decreases, leading to an increase in fat mass and a secondary increase in leptin level, as if by dialing down leptin sensitivity, you increase the weight of an individual. Okay, this and other evidence has suggested to us that most obesity is a result of leptin insensitivity, an intrinsic insensitivity. Now, there's an empiric question that flows from this, which is to ask, well, if obese individuals already make a lot of their own leptin, what good might it do to give them extra leptin? The first answer to that question was in a study in the 1990s that showed, in fact, if you give extra leptin to patients, you can see a significant decrease in weight in obese individuals that can be pretty profound in some individuals. The problem with this study is that the doses that were being delivered were too high, and it was not possible in a commercial setting to deliver amounts of the protein that were required. And so the use of leptin for obesity lay fallow until more recently, when in the first case it's been shown that there are a subset of obese individuals who respond very robustly to lower doses of leptin. And in the second case, it's been shown that if you combine leptin with other weight loss agents, you can see pretty significant weight, as I'll show you now. But in order to tell you why this combination appears to be effective, I need to expand the territory we cover in terms of thinking about how food intake is regulated. Food intake is regulated by what are referred to as short and long-term systems. The long-term system is the leptin system I've told you about. The short-term system is that system that controls food intake during a single day. It controls how hungry you feel between meals and how easily full you feel during a meal, how satiated you are. The purpose of the long-term system is to maintain adequate stores of nutrient as fat. The purpose of the short-term system is to keep the blood levels of nutrient at relatively constant levels during the day. Now, each of these systems operate on a daily basis and they talk to each other. And so the notion has been put forth that if you only target the long-term system, the short-term system will compensate and vice versa. So these short-term signals that include molecules you may have heard about, insulin, amylin, peptide YY, GLP-1, and so on, all regulate the short-term system. And the concern is if you were to give leptin alone, in the absence of these other agents, they would then compensate. I should tell you that gastric bypass surgeons believe that gastric bypass surgery works by changing the levels of a cocktail of these gut hormones that regulate appetite during the day. Now, all of this preamble has been to suggest that many have believed, or to tell you that many have believed, that an effective therapy for obesity will require that we combine a short-term and a long-term signal. And the company that's developing leptin decided to test a combination of leptin and one of these short-term signals, which is an anti-diabetic treatment named amylin, which is another hormone made by your pancreas. This compound has anti-diabetic effects, but it also reduces food intake and body weight to a small extent by acting again on the brain. And so this company decided to combine leptin and amylin in clinical trials. And now when you look at the combination, what you can see is probably the largest weight loss in any clinical study that's been done. This combination now results in 13% weight loss to all comers in this study that was done. Now, this is in clinical development. When or whether this makes its way to being a drug remains to be seen and is many years off. But it does suggest now that a deeper understanding of the biological system that regulates weight can have profound effects to reduce weight. And I think that's something to hope for. And so just to be clear, what's shown here is the results of single treatments with either amylin or leptin alone. And this is the results of the combination. You can see this 14 or 13% weight loss. So new therapies may be on the way, though this development process takes time. As a scientist, we don't do clinical studies of the sort that I just described. They were done by companies. Our objective as scientists is to try to understand what causes leptin resistance. Why is it that obese individuals respond less well to leptin than do lean individuals? Now, this is going to be a difficult challenge because leptin acts on the nervous system to regulate a behavior, food intake. And so what we surmise from this is that leptin normally has critical effects on populations of neurons that regulate weight. And for some reason, the ability of leptin to exert that effect is lost in the leptin-resistant or obese state. Not only will we have to understand how leptin acts on individual nerve cells, we'll also have to understand how those nerve cells are integrated into circuits that control behavior. Now, in the last decade, we've made an enormous amount of progress dissecting the nature of the circuits that respond to leptin. And I want to tell you about them because the logic is satisfying. In the brain, there are populations of nerves, both in animals and in humans, that when activated either increase or decrease feeding. A classic example of a neural population that activates appetite expresses the receptor for leptin and another substance called NPY. And when these neurons are activated and release this substance, an animal, or based on the available evidence, a human will eat more. Conversely, a second population of neurons expresses the receptor for leptin, another peptide, MSH, and when these neurons fire, MSH acts on its receptor to inhibit feeding. Leptin works by inhibiting the neurons that activate feeding and activating the neurons that inhibit feeding. So if you make no leptin, such as is the case for the leptin-deficient child or the mouse, these neurons are maximally active, these are off, and you eat more. If you give extra leptin, these are activated, these are shut off, and you eat less. And as leptin concentration changes, the balance of activity between these pathways similarly changes, and that's what regulates food intake. Now, this circuit has attracted a great deal of attention from the basic science community as well as from the pharmaceutical industry because mutations in it cause human obesity. And that includes not only leptin, but the receptor for leptin, this compound MSH, as well as its receptor called the MC4 receptor. The names don't matter. What matters is if you add up all of these mutations in a cohort of morbidly obese patients, 10 to 15% have mutations in one or more of these 4 genes. So what that means is that 10 to 15% of morbidly obese patients not only have a mutation that causes obesity, they have a mutation that we can identify. And I'm quite confident that with the advent of advances in DNA sequencing technology that this number will grow. I should point out to you that this is at least a 10-fold or higher mutation rate to explain disease than is the case for any other complex medical condition such as heart disease or hypertension. What this means, of course, is that if you see someone who's morbidly obese on the street and assume that this is a consequence of a lack of willpower on their part or a toxic environment, then you would be demonstrably wrong 10 to 15% of the time, and I believe in time you'll be wrong an even greater percentage of the time. Now, I told you earlier that 70 to 80% of the variance, or 80 to 90% of the variance in body weight is ascribed to genetic factors. Some of that will be additional genes we don't know about. Others will be interactions between genes and environment. So there's room to find more genes, and I'll explain to you in a moment how we can think about and how environmental factors interact with them. Now, we believe this scheme gives us a unique opportunity to study human behavior because we have in this system a defined stimulus, leptin, a discrete number of responding cells in a region of the brain that controls a basic behavior, and a measurable behavioral output. And the really deep question that we have not made much progress in is to ask the question, what happens in between? Now, feeding is what's known as a complex motivational behavior. What this means is that many factors influence the likelihood that you'll eat, but none guarantee it. So this is in contrast to a reflex, where a defined stimulus typically gives an invariant response. Not so for a complex motivational behavior. Each of these and many other factors influence the likelihood you'll eat, but none guarantee it. So leptin is relevant, other nutrients are relevant, such as glucose, but so are sensory factors, smell and vision. So are emotional factors. And so are higher cognitive factors, such as the conscious desire to lose or gain weight. This has implied to investigators for decades that there must be a part of our brains that collates all of this relevant information and then makes a decision, eat or don't eat. It's basically a go, no go decision for this and other behaviors. Not only do we not understand how complex information of this sort is processed in the brain to make a relativistic decision of this sort, we don't even know where in our brain this decision is made. And so there's an enormous opportunity and challenge embedded in trying to understand how complex information is processed to lead to a behavioral decision. I should emphasize to you that volition, while playing a role, is not the only factor. And so that for volition to lead to a stable reduction of weight, it would have to overcome the potency of these other stimuli. Well, while many questions remain about how higher-order neural processing of this sort takes place, I want to now close by telling you that at the same time we've learned a lot about a physiologic circuit that regulates appetite. It's composed as a classic feedback loop, similar to an air conditioner in a way, where a signal is read out with a change in an effector limb. And what this means is that body weight is regulated by a feedback loop composed of an afferent signal in the form of leptin, key integratory centers analogous to a thermostat in basic centers of the brain, and then a series of outputs that change behavior, weight. And I would like to argue that this level of biologic understanding in time will provide a basis for understanding not only how biological factors regulate weight, the various relevant the various things that influence weight, rather than think of one to the exclusion of the others. I'd like to suggest that it is only by a deeper understanding of this sort of circuit that I believe will make progress treating obesity. The sort of recommendation the obese get is they should eat less and exercise more. That recommendation was first put forth by Hippocrates 2,000 years ago, and I would like to believe that modern medicine and science can do better than repeating a 2,000-year-old nostrum for which there's no better evidence today than there was then. Rather, I would like to propose that we approach the problem the same way we would If you lesion that, weight will increase. And also a region of the brain known as the amygdala, which controls emotional processing. There is no lesion that I know of or that's been reported in higher centers that would qualify as this putative integratory center that cause a change in weight. So the lesion studies don't tell us anything. And my speculation is that the same region will control multiple behaviors and there'll be crosstalk. So you'd have to probably lesion specific nerve cells in that group rather than all the neurons in the group, because it would affect multiple behaviors. Because after all, drinking and eating make use of a similar motor paradigm. So it would make sense if they were overlapping, and I think that's why the lesioning hasn't worked. Now, there are newer methods that allow you to lesion not whole regions of the brain, but specific populations of cells, and that's exactly what we're trying to do to try to find this center. We don't know the answer yet. Oh.
One thing about, in the past, there's been some experimental work on calorie-restricted diets,
Yeah.
and if it's just on limits of life, and all that. Any of these studies in terms of the leptin levels?
So the question is, you mean about longevity?
Yes.
Okay, so the question has to do with the fact that in certain animal species, if you reduce the number of calories they ingest, lifespan is lengthened, and there's hope or speculation on the part of some that extreme caloric restriction would lengthen life in humans. First of all, I should say that the more recent data on that topic in human are not encouraging. But setting that aside, there doesn't appear to be any role for leptin in that. We actually considered that possibility because if you are calorically restricted, you become hypometabolic and leptin goes down, and that maybe that had some explanatory power, but it doesn't seem to be the case. I'll just give you one other bit of information that's a little bit outside of your question, which is that I think the animal studies are to some extent being overinterpreted for mice and especially lower invertebrates such as worms. These animals, when they're calorically restricted, enter a state of near hibernation. It's called the dour state in worms. It's called torpor in mice. And so it's not like they're living happily and going to the movies. They're kind of like in a vegetative state almost. So it's not clear to me that the lengthening of lifespan is of the sort that most people would aspire to. Okay, one more question. Oh, all right, two more. One in. Well, so if you're obese and have a high leptin level, the problem isn't that your leptin level is high. The problem is that the high level you make doesn't work well enough. If you lower leptin, so the question then is, if they are high and you lowered the leptin level further, below where it was, what would happen? And actually they gain weight. Animals gain weight. So if you give a leptin antagonist to an obese animal, they'll get heavier. So in a way, the obese patient is dependent on that high level of leptin to even stay at the weight they are. Okay, and one last question up there.
How does the increase in lean muscle mass correlate with leptin?
Yeah, so I think the leptin system is very specific to fat tissue, meaning it regulates fat mass in either direction.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. That was wonderful. I have a question. As the discoverer of leptin, did you name it, and why did you name it leptin?
So I did name it. That was a fun thing to do. I named it basically because I used to refer to the OB mouse as having an obesity gene, and a former Nobel Prize winner named Roger Guillemin heard me give a talk, and he came up to me when I was just starting out, and he said, you shouldn't be calling that an obesity gene because the normal gene keeps the mouse thin, and only when it's lacking does it become obese, so it's really a lean gene. I said, okay, fine. About a few weeks later, he sent me a letter that I still have in which he said, well, I realize I said you should call it a lean gene, but that doesn't sound very good. I think what you should do is call it a lepto gene, because lepto is the Greek root for thin. So when it came time to name it, I remembered the letter from Roger, and that's where the name leptin came from.
started in the concentration camps and almost starved to death, did their weight go back? Did they have normal amount of obesity rates?
So, I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that in general, if people become very lean, they'll go back to the weight they started out, much the same as they would if they've dieted. Now, you're in a sense asking, does anything different happen if there's life-threatening starvation? My instinct is that it would be pretty much the same, but I don't actually know the specific data in response to your